Hey, it's Marko here from Victoria, BC at Fair Realty. Today I'm talking about the brand new landlord use notice generator released by the government yesterday, and all I can say is what the F. I'm going to talk about this in context of a buyer purchasing a property that is currently rented and giving the appropriate notice to the tenant, which used to be 2 months, now it's 4 months as of yesterday. So before this landlord use notice generator went up online yesterday, when a buyer, he or she removed all conditions on the purchase of a property that was rented, then they would provide a form to the listing agent, who would give it to the landlord, and the landlord would give the tenant 2 months notice, now 4 months notice. On this form that the buyer was disclosing or confirming that they would be living in the property, we would have to list the buyer's name and the buyer's address. I've actually had issues with this amount of information in the past. Let me give you an example. Last year, I had a young, lovely couple, late 20s. They bought their first property, a condo that had a renter in place. Well, once conditions were removed, we provided all the appropriate paperwork. This was given to the landlord, who gave it to the tenant. Well, guess what? The tenant was able to see my buyer's address on those forms, and he actually went to the buyer's address, a property my buyers were renting, knocked on their door and asked them if they would extend the rental to him of this condo. Obviously, my buyers were very intimidated with the tenant showing up at their door asking for this. So sometimes too much information can actually be a bad thing. But with this landlord use notice generator, far more information is required to be provided to the tenant, and some of it is just completely crazy in my opinion. For example, the buyer has to provide their birth dates to the tenant. On top of that, amongst other things, a full copy of the contract and purchase of sale has to be provided to the tenant. I find this absolutely absurd. You might be questioning, well, Marko, what's the problem? Well, for example, when I'm representing a buyer and I write up a contract on a property that's rented and my buyer is planning on moving in, I put in clauses to protect my buyer, such as it's a fundamental term of this contract that the property is delivered vacant on possession, free of any tenancies, amongst other clauses that put the onus of the risk of the tenant moving out onto the seller, not my buyer. Well, the problem is going to be when a tenant gets a copy of this contract, they're going to be like, I see that the seller has agreed to some clauses here, which really puts them under pressure to deliver this property vacant. So you're going to see tenants using this information to call up the seller a week before completion and say, hey, listen, if you want me out, I'm going to demand this much cash. Otherwise, I know you're in trouble based on the clauses in the contract of purchase and sale you agree to with the buyer. Many other things go into contracts which the tenant should not have access to. For example, sometimes I put in professional cleaning clauses into the contract. Well, if the tenant sees this, they're going to say, well, the seller agreed to have the unit professionally cleaned, the carpet's professionally cleaned. Why should I clean the unit? They might leave it a pigsty. I could talk about this for another hour, why it's a really bad idea for the tenant to have a contract that's been signed between the seller and the buyer. What does this have to do with the tenant? This is absolutely absurd. I have no idea who the hell in the government's coming up with these policies. What's next? Are we going to ask the buyer to provide their SIN number and 3 years of tax returns to the tenants? This makes no sense whatsoever. I think there's some major privacy concerns with this as well. I think all of this policy that's being introduced in the last couple of years is actually going to severely decrease the number of available rental units on the market. Sure, tenants are going to have more rights, they're going to have more information, but they're going to have nothing to rent, which is going to drive up rental rates. You also have people like my parents. My parents own a house in the Oaklands area that has a suite. They've been renting that suite since 1997 for 27 years. We've had great tenants. We've treated tenants with respect. I've made friends from Tanzania, Japan that have rented my parents' suite over the years, and I help my parents rent out this suite. Going forward, once the current set of tenants moves out, I don't think we're going to re-rent it. My parents don't need the money. They paid off their house 15 years ago. My parents go to a restaurant once a year. They really don't need to rent the suite, but they rent it because it's there. But why would they continue renting it with the government just taking away their property rights? It's getting crazier and crazier. I don't know what happens next, but I'm really disturbed personally by this new landlord use notice generator that has to be filled out online and all the documents that have to be provided to the tenant. This is going to cause some massive problems. I don't think anyone in the government is giving this any thought. That's it for this week. Marko, Juras, Fair Realty.